Yes, guys, I just finished up a chat with Jay Edmunds, Performance Coach Edmunds. You can find him on Instagram. He's been working with a lot of aspiring AFL athletes that are, trying to work on different aspects of their game, using kind of some draft combine data and just talking about different types of players. We sort of explore different theories on what makes a good athlete, what makes a good AFL footballer, and I think there's plenty of theories and plenty of nice stuff in there. So I hope you like the clip. Check it out. I kind of want to get into this, tap into this sort of idea of speed in the game. So I don't want to discredit any other attributes or anything like that, but I sort of just want to kind of hone in on the importance of speed. And I got that quote off your website, which was around the idea that athletes get bigger contracts for having speed. They score more often than other athletes that don't have speed do. Why do you think, and for any sort of an athlete, but particularly for Australian rules football, why do you think it's so important to have speed?
Yeah, I think if you look at all ball sports, but particularly AFL, the way the game's going, people view the game as a very complex set of rules, complex, chaotic sort of environment and whatnot. But when we break the game down into simple concepts, it's basically you're either in attack or you're in defense. So when we're looking at it from a defensive point of view, the ability to close down space and apply pressure is a really big rating that a lot of clubs and players and whatnot are sort of moving towards in terms of creating turnovers and stuff like that. So in order to play that type of game, you're going to have the players in place that can be fast enough and agile enough to apply that pressure onto the opposition player. So, from a defensive point of view, being able to close down space is going to be heavily reliant on speed. But also, if we look at it from an attacking point of view, being able to create separation. So, whether that's through effective ball movement or through um, just physical, be able to separate from, whether that's from a lead or from breaking from a stoppage or whatever, to be able to then have more time and space to be able to dispose of the ball. So that's essentially when I look at its speed in all ball sports, but particularly AFL, we're either trying to utilize our speed to create space and scoring opportunities, or we're trying to close down space and apply pressure so we can then turn the ball back over. So essentially, as I said, that applies to all ball sports, but from an AFL perspective, the game's only getting faster. High speed running is only increasing. So at the end of the day, speed kills. So yeah, I guess that's a bit of a short rundown for that.
Yeah, I like that. Do you think that, a little piece I grabbed onto there is that you said the game's getting faster? Do you think that the way, as someone who trains athletes, do you think the way that we kind of view speed and endurance has changed over the years? Because I think there used to be this idea of players, I don't know, general fitness of players being about the endurance side of the game more than the speed side of the game. Do you think that's sort of a moving sort of narrative or a changing narrative in Australian football?
Yeah, I think obviously AFL's by nature, it still is very much a endurance dominated sport, but it's what people forget to realize is it's a high intensity repeat effort sport. So in order to be able to repeat effort, you need to have those you need to be able to demonstrate that high intensity. So the way I look at it from, I guess a training lens and stuff like that, what I'm trying to do from an athletic point of view is raise an athlete's ceiling by increasing their speed or their acceleration performance, their ability to produce high intensity efforts. And then where, say, the endurance side of the equation, that's going to be heavily geared towards how quickly I can recover between those high intensity efforts. So as AFL, as I said, it's obviously a very aerobic dominated sport, but a lot of people miss the fact that because it's so aerobically dominant, they neglect the high intensity efforts or the plays that are going to actually open up the game or close down the space, as I was talking about before. And they sort of get stuck into this one pace, one dimensional volume in the leg sort of type training where we're never sort of addressing that speed or that ceiling of which athletes can sort of is going to allow them to sort of be able to demonstrate those game breaking sort of plays with that. So yeah, to answer the question, I think it's definitely shifting in regards to how to prepare because I think in the past, once October hits, November hits, most people go out. All right, let's hit some 400s, let's hit some 800s, let's hit some long runs, etc., which is all still somewhat valid from the endurance side of things. But I think a lot of people are starting to shift now. It's like, all right, how can I improve my power? How can I improve my explosiveness, my speed, my strength, my change of direction? And I think you're getting a lot more, I guess, private strength and conditioning facilities and a lot more accessible information out on social media and whatnot. And most of it, there's obviously the good and bad that you take with social media, but I wish, even back when I was playing, I had the access to a lot of the information around training methods, around improving some of these qualities compared to, back 10, 15 years ago, where most people were sort of making it up as they go, or just, as I said, getting miles in the legs was probably the sort of underlying theme that would tend to go with that.
I totally agree. Like that thing that you said there, where you kind of wish you could go back to when you were sort of training and that sort of thing. I feel a bit the same because we used to just do everything was long runs. Um, and now, like hearing about some of the science behind it all with like top speed, and it kind of brings me into this maximal speed stuff with athletes and the anaerobic speed reserve. Are you able to just kind of give the listeners just a little bit on that and why that is so important?
Yeah, so the anaerobic speed reserve, it's been around for a little bit, but it's probably been, I guess, popularized by a few people. Gareth Sanford's one person that's sort of been pretty big on it, but there's obviously a lot of other practitioners and stuff that are big on it. But I think when we're looking at high intensity repeat effort sport like AFL, it's sort of the bread and butter of what we're trying to achieve as an athlete. So the anaerobic speed reserve is the difference between your maximal sprinting speed. So theoretically, someone that has a high maximal sprinting speed would be someone that can run close to 10 meters per second. Um, and the difference between your maximal sprinting speed and your maximal aerobic speed. So your maximal aerobic speed is measured through, say, a 2 kilometer time trial. And then we get this gap. So you might have some athletes that have a really high max velocity, and then a low maximal aerobic speed or a 2K time trial. And then you're going to get everywhere in between. So from there, as an athlete, you can then start to profile different athletes around their strengths and weaknesses and whatnot. But just to go back to how important I think speed reserve is that if you look at a game of AFL, you're going to get footballers that are going to cover anywhere from 2 to 3 to 3.5K even of high speed running above your maximal aerobic speed. So where your speed reserve comes into play is the faster you have to run over your 2 kilometer time trial pace, the more important your maximal sprinting speed starts to become. And as I said before, footballers might be covering 2 to 3K of this high speed running in a game. That's all the important plays in a game that's going to impact uh, all the main sort of parts in the game. So by simply just trying to improve your 2K time trial while neglecting the speed element, you're sort of only addressing half the equation with that. So for me, as I said, speed reserve is critical to try and raise your maximal sprinting speed, but also still try and raise that maximal aerobic speed with that and so forth.
I'll double back into this a little bit, but how do you work on those two things simultaneously without robbing Peter to pay
Yeah,
Paul?
Yeah, and that's probably the hardest part with a sport like AFL, because if you compare that to, say, sports like pure like speed and power based sports like NFL or track and field or a lot of these different things, they're generally only working on one end of the equation, and basically that speed and power thing. So when it comes to I guess like AFL, where they have this really high balance between both speed and endurance, it certainly does make it trickier. But I think you just got to go back to applying key principles around improving both. So generally, I try and theme certain sessions within the week. So, for example, day one could be a speed day, day two might be a power day, or day three might be endurance day, and just different elements of that where we're having specific themes on each day, and we're trying to maximize that quality on each day rather than sort of slapping them all together and getting a whole heap of interference between the two sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. And with that, I think it's important people, when we're talking about speed here, I think it's important to get terminology right too. So, maximal sprinting speed, or when we're doing like speed training, what we're trying to do is deliver 100% maximal outputs, generally over short distances of usually 10 to 50 meters, 10 to 40 meters, depending on the athlete's ability to accelerate. And we're going to have very long rest periods. So this might sound crazy, but in general, for every 10 meters sprinted, we're going to be looking to have at least 60 seconds rest per effort. So if I'm doing, you know, 6 30-meter sprints, for example, at the start of a session, I'm going to be wanting at least 3 minute rest between each of those sprints, which for a lot of people, that might sound crazy, but you need to remember that developing speed is at the opposite end of the spectrum to developing endurance, which is the opposite, where you're trying to build high volume, short rest periods, and whatnot. So this is why I think having those themes on different training days, whether it's more speed focused on one day, more volume or endurance focused on another day, and whatnot with that.
And that's with the big rests. That's really all about being able to actually perform what you're doing at like as fresh as you possibly can, right? So that you're always training as hard as possible.
Yeah, correct. And I guess our fast twitch fiber recruitment and being able to stimulate the nervous system to a really high degree, we need to ensure we're generating like maximal outputs. And generally, as I said, any form of fatigue that starts to creep in these type of sessions will often be at a detriment to the athlete's speed development. So um, people also need to understand that sprinting is relatively technical as well. So you've got two ends of the spectrum. You've got, I guess, the physical side of sprinting. So whether that's power, elasticity, and just pure speed capabilities. But we've also got a relatively large technical component to be able to make sure that we're being as efficient as possible with that. But yeah, so it's your speed days are all about outputs. Whereas your endurance days are more going to be about volume and shorter recovery.
I might just circle back here to what you just said there. You used the word elasticity. There's a few bits of terminology I think we use in this space, like with speed, with explosiveness, power, strength, and another one is elasticity. Can you sort of break down some of those terms a little bit and kind of just try to paint a picture of what they mean?
Yeah, so yeah, it's an interesting one because people use these terms interchangeably and sometimes don't always know like what they mean and whatnot. But by definition, like power, for example, power equals force times velocity or strength times speed. So essentially, when you someone would say an athlete is powerful, someone like a if I said someone like a even when Dustin Martin or Christian Petrarca or Jason Horn-Francis or Patrick Dangerfield, these guys that are quite strong, but they're also very explosive. Generally, these athletes have got a good combination of strength, but also speed relative to that. If we look at things like elasticity, so this is basically, I always like to use the analogy of either like an elastic band or like a bouncy ball. So if I drop a cricket ball on the ground or something like a beach ball, it's just going to like probably plonk pretty quickly into the ground, and there's not going to be a lot of elasticity. Whereas if I drop something like a bouncy ball or anything that has a bit more of like a reactive component, it's obviously going to rebound off the ground a lot more quicker. And our tendons and our muscles work in a very similar fashion. So guys that would be deemed as more elastic dominant is basically you look at guys like Shea Bolton, guys like Charlie Cameron potentially. A lot of the guys that can get off the ground very quickly, they're able to change direction very sharp. And even though they might look at not necessarily be very powerful, even though technically they still are powerful, but by definition of what we're sort of talking about here, they're relying on those elastic qualities to be able to generate speed very, very rapidly, basically, with that. So, yeah, so I think, yeah, you've got a continuum all the way from very strength dominant to power dominant to velocity dominant, and then you got spectrums in between that.
I think there's a lot to unpack there, of course, but yeah, I think you do hear like those things about a certain player, and you'll see that a really strong player or like a big bodied midfielder will get called explosive or powerful. And often they probably only have on that like continuum that you mentioned there, they probably really are just strong. They're not actually fast as well, which is that kind of combination that actually means someone is sort of explosive. So to have both of those means you're probably more likely to be able to like break through tackles and things like that to apply it to a real life thing. On the elasticity point that you mentioned there, do you think that's something that's trainable, or is that more to do with like muscle composition, innate muscle composition that you kind of want to have before you start training?
Yeah, like there's obviously a relatively large genetic component around things like tendon stiffness, like fast twitch fiber, etc. But through training, you can definitely make some pretty large modifiable like changes with that. So, like things like RSI or reactive strength index is an assessment that a lot of coaches are starting to use with like repeated pogo jumps or stepping off a box and rebounding and whatnot. And generally, you can make pretty large changes to this through a variety of different training methods, through the use of plyometric training, different heavy resistance training where you're trying to improve the stiffness of the tendon. So that if the tendons are stiffer, it's going to be able to, there's more tension there. Once it gets stretched, it's going to be able to snap back harder. So generally, building strength and also plyometrics can help train this method. But there's definitely a large genetic component to this. It's just how lucky your parent, you were to have the right parents, I guess, with that sort of point of view.
With all of those attributes that we talk about there, is there any one of those that you think is more trainable than the others?
Okay. So if we look at it from a continuum, obviously strength is probably going to be the easiest to improve, um, regardless of genetics and stuff like that. Everyone can get decently strong, especially when we're looking in the context of like a footballer strength compared to say like a powerlifter strength. Every footballer can get pretty strong if they're consistent enough and they've got good programming over a long period of time. You can generally get to relatively high levels of strength, even if you're not necessarily deemed a strong athlete to start with. Um, we then look in the middle where you're probably going to look at something like power. So this could be something like a standing vertical jump, which is often measured at the combine. Maybe very early phases of acceleration. So it could be your first 5 to 10 meters would be deemed as more power dominant. These qualities are probably in the middle. So it's like, we can definitely positively influence these a fair bit. But there is still somewhat of a genetic component. And then if we look at the far ends of the spectrum, we have like pure things like maximal velocity, maybe some elasticity sort of metrics with that, where they're very heavily genetic, but we can still modify by relatively, even small changes can still make a positive impact on performance with that. But yeah, you're not going to turn an athlete running 8 meters per second and then turn them into running 10 meters per second, regardless of what training you sort of do with that, unless they're just a kid or something like that, maybe. But yeah.
Oh, I just want to go back a bit here we talked about it before, the anaerobic speed reserve, because I think this is an area that has a lot of impact. When you're doing two players, you're looking at two different players and also the effect on the entire team. When you look at speed across an entire team versus speed across and not like two teams versing each other, which one's got the highest maximal speed, that can actually have a real impact on the game. I just wanted to look at it player by player. So if you've got two guys and you've got one that's a really good sprinter and one that's got a really good 2K time trial. So if we look at two players from the combine, one goes sub 3 seconds in the 20-meter sprint. The other one's pretty slow, a 3.25, something like that. And then you've got one that ran a 6-minute 10 versus a 6-minute 40 2-kilometer time trial. Which one of those are you looking at and saying that's a little bit better to work with as far as from a football perspective?
Yeah. So you spoke about before when we're looking at strength, power, speed, which one's the easiest to train and which one's the hardest to train, etc. Same sort of thing applies when it comes to like the endurance end of the spectrum as well. So generally, endurance is very easy to improve. So, you know, if you give me an athlete that is very slow but has good endurance compared to an athlete that is naturally quite fast, but the endurance may not quite be there just yet, I'm probably always going to lean towards the more powerful, faster athlete with that. And it's only because endurance can be trained relatively fast with consistency and good programming. Whereas, as I said before, when it comes to those pure speed metrics, yes, we can positively influence them through good training. However, it's going to be a lot harder, especially when you're combining that with very high volumes of running at different times of the year, where there will be probably some interference with that. So, yeah, to answer that question, definitely the more faster athlete, even if the endurance side of the thing, science side of the equation isn't necessarily where you want it to be, just because of how quickly you can make those endurance improvements with that as well.
Yeah, and I've kind of tapped into some of the content that I've seen from you and just sort of looking at that when you've got a guy that's got extra pace, how that actually taps into with that anaerobic speed reserve that we talked about, that actually taps into endurance as well. Because if you've got two players, like let's say it's me and you, right? Just to go over that anaerobic speed reserve thing again, you and I there, you run top speed 40 kilometers an hour, totally arbitrary number there. I run 30 kilometers an hour. It's harder for me when I'm trying to go at that not even necessarily like a 2 kilometer time trial pace, but if I'm looking to go for that sort of repeat effort and I'm going 25 kilometers an hour, I'm 5 kilometers away from my maximum speed, and it's going to be hurting me more than for you to be going, say, somewhere between 25 and 30, where you're still traveling faster, but you're further away from that top speed, right?
Yeah, and I think this is where people get like when it comes to training, they sort of get um, you know, a bit confused with like how to train. But you're right. Like if you improve your speed and whatnot, you are addressing the endurance equation with that as well. So you're not going to develop speed by doing repeat long, slow distance running or even doing 400s and 800s and whatnot. As I alluded to at the start, you're only going to improve that speed reserve by raising your ceiling. In regards to those maximal outputs with long rest periods and whatnot. So that's something that should be focused on day one preseason. If that's been deemed a key performance indicator that you need to work on for the preseason ahead and whatnot.
We touched on, I forget the name of the Canadian sports scientist that you pull a lot of work from there, but we talk about those athletic profiles, and this is more of a physiological thing, like more of a genetical thing, but we talk about those like speed profile, the endurance profile, and the other one is the hybrid profile, right? So what does all of that mean?
Yeah, so that was from Gareth Sanford, Canadian physiologist. He's working with Team Canada um, with a lot of their endurance-based sports and whatnot. But basically, Gareth came up with a continuum from, yeah, as I said, speed, hybrid, and endurance, and sort of bucketing athletes into different these different buckets based off their physical attributes. So, what he deemed as a speed profile would be an athlete that could generate high velocities, something up around probably 10 meters per second. But this was more from like a fiber type composition, sort of that. So generally, these athletes that are capable of running over those 10 meters per second, they often don't have the slow twitch muscle fiber composition to be able to also run, a sub 6 minute or 2 kilometer time trial, for example. So they're very speed dominant. They have very high outputs. They often fatigue very quickly if they get asked to do like a lot of long, slow distance stuff. And they're going to be more suited towards that very high intensity repeat effort sort of based model. If we look at the other end of the spectrum, we've got more of our endurance profiles. And these athletes are going to be athletes that are generally a little bit slower when it comes to their maximum velocity. So theoretically, anything sort of below 9.8, which still might be relatively fast if we look at it from a general football standpoint. But let's say an athlete that can run 8.5, even up to 9 meters per second, but they've got very good endurance capabilities. They can run, say, like a 6 minute 2K or a 6:10 or something along the lines of that. Um, they're going to be more suited towards their fiber composition is going to be much more compatible with some of the longer based stuff, the volume work and whatnot. It's not to say that you're not trying to improve their maximal sprinting speed, because that's still going to have a positive impact on the speed reserve, especially for like repeat effort sport. Um, but they're just going to be more able to tolerate and handle higher volumes of running in a training program compared to those speed profiles that will probably have to have a slightly different program in place to factor in that fiber composition. And then you've got the best of both worlds, which is sort of in the middle. So these are hybrid profiles. These athletes are still incredibly fast. They're probably, honestly, the difference between the speed and the hybrid may not change that drastically in terms of the actual top speed. So we're still sort of looking up close to this 10 meter per second sort of framework. But these guys also have some of those intermediate fibers where they can also still be able to handle volume and be able to, demonstrate really good like endurance sort of metrics, as well as having a high speed sort of metric. And they're sort of, I guess, the best of both worlds that with that.
I guess the next question there is how can you apply that to probably like two different areas there? One is training. So how you train the athlete, which you touched on a little bit there. And then the other one, I guess, is like talent ID. And if you're looking for the perfect, I don't know, if you're looking for the perfect AFL footballer, what's probably the best scenario there?
Yeah, so generally, like, the hybrid setup, AFL is a massive combination of both speed and endurance. So anyone that has a blend of both is going to be pretty dominant from a physical, purely from a physical side of things. Take technical and skill out of the equation. Um, but yeah, so from a training standpoint, so someone who I'd probably deem as more of like an endurance profile could be someone like Sam Walsh, for example, who can clock up really high Ks, runs all day, doesn't necessarily have that out and out burst or that can really open the game up, but is able to run all day. So from a training perspective, he's going to be able to handle higher Ks in the training week, let's say in the preseason and whatnot. So like he might be able to handle those 30, those 40 plus K weeks and whatnot, because that's his bread and butter. He's able to recover very quickly from that type of training because that's his framework. Now, as I said, with him, I'd still try and spend some time trying to increase that, whether it's acceleration or top speed, change of direction, whatever. That's still going to be a part of the program. It's just that his strengths, we're talking about strengths and weaknesses, his strength is always going to be going back towards that endurance side of the equation. Whereas if we look at the other end of the spectrum, and as I said, it's hard to sort of purely identify, we could say someone like a Charlie Cameron or whatever, who I know can hit around that 10 meter per second. Um, you know, he's doing those really long, slow, continuous sort of running methods. May not be overly, that might actually crush the athlete a fair bit and sort of make them a bit stale, so that their speed work then starts to feel very flat and they can't actually feel bouncy and they don't feel like they're on top of the ground. So it's more just going to be the volume, also the duration of the reps. So, for example, with endurance based athletes, if we're doing more endurance work, the duration of the reps might be longer. Whereas with a speed based profile, we might only be doing like a minute on, minute off, or something along the lines of that, where they're never actually dipping too far into the well in terms of um, that fatigue and that continuous. And we're sort of trying to stimulate it from that point of view. But as I said, so the speed based guys, a lot of people talk about like repeat sprint training or very repeat effort, where you got to do a very high sprint with relatively short rest periods and then go again. Generally, your speed profiles and definitely your hybrid profiles will be able to tolerate that type of training well because it's so far above their speed reserve. Whereas the endurance guys are going to blow up really quickly with that type of work just because they haven't got the buffer because their speed reserve is so small. So anything that, as I said, that requires them to go faster than that 2K time trial, and especially a significantly higher amount above that 2K time trial, that type of running is actually going to beat that athlete up a fair bit compared to the speed guys that can sort of just go on autopilot and cruise control because they're not actually working that hard, as we were talking about before with that speed reserve sort of point of view.
So what's the threshold with those speed guys where they do start to fatigue? What's the threshold for them? Because they obviously their speed helps them on some level with the high intensity stuff. They can kind of do the repeat efforts because they have that maximal speed. But what's the thing that kind of cuts them out?
Yeah, so like it's case by case scenarios. Like even these speed guys, they're still going to have to do a certain volume of running to be able to play AFL football because it's not like, as I said, it's not a pure speed power based sport. The threshold is hard to tell. Like it's hard to sort of put an actual number on something like that because there's still going to be variation between athlete to athlete. Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky one to answer, but like if we're looking at like a 2K time trial or something like that in terms of like with that, I'd say anything sort of sub 630, 620, a lot of these speed guys are probably going to struggle to get much lower than that. Like 630 might be sort of like around that 640, even like somewhere around that marker might be where that threshold is in terms of, being able to go much faster than that without sort of starting to shift things a little bit with that.
Do you think when you talked about the speed guys really kind of having burnout at some point, do you think there's a sort of, I guess, like a mistake from football pundits that sort of talk about some of these players like a Harley Reid or a Jason Horne-Francis because it is just normal that they fatigue quicker based on their profile?
Yeah, no, once again, there's a lot of factors that could go into that. Like there's going to be certain players that chase a lot harder or defend a lot harder than other players. So they might look like they gas out earlier, but they're actually working harder both ways. So they actually need a greater rest. So I think it's hard to know without actually seeing like the whole like numbers and what's actually going on in the game. Because you're right, you see guys that go to the bench and people say, oh, they're not fit enough. But until you actually look at the numbers and actually see like what are they doing both in attack and defense, like are they actually working harder, and they need, because they're working higher, like the intensity is so much higher, they actually need the break, or is it more because of, yeah, like I said, so that's one thing that to look at with that. um yeah, but I think definitely, there's going to be certain types of players that are going to be more geared towards that very frenetic sort of pace, and they'll probably need more frequent breaks. Whereas you're going to have those other guys that just sort of go a little bit more at that cruise pace, and they sort of just more get contest to contest, accumulate across the game. And they're going to be able to obviously be able to spend more time on the ground and be able to operate at a more comfortable pace, because that's just how they play. So I think you just got to look at the nature and the style of play that the footballer has, and then you watch obviously do they have the physiological underpinnings to be able to play that role in the team? Because like if you ask Sam Walsh to play the same role as say like a Charlie Cameron or a Shea Bolton or something like that in the team, it's probably not going to end well, because that's not he doesn't have the physiological underpinnings to be able to play that pressure role, or be able to do the things because that's not his bread and butter. His bread and butter is being able to accumulate, run all day, get from contest to contest, etc. I don't know if that answered that, but yeah.
No, it's some good takeaways there. When you do look at those profiles, the hybrid, the speed, and the endurance player, which one's easier to find? So what's the rare one, and what's if you're looking at, again, if you're applying that to talent ID, what could potentially bump somebody up because of their athleticism?
Yeah, so like we talk about speed profiles and hybrid profiles. They're actually quite rare when we look at it from a team sport point of view. Even footballers, like the amount of footballers that can run up around 10 meters per second, even at AFL level and whatnot, is relatively small. We're talking a relatively small percentage of even of at the top level that can do that. So I think, what was the second part of the question? What were you sort of alluding to that?
So I talked about basically just when you're looking for it from a talent ID perspective, and you're looking at those three profiles, could potentially, and we talk, like you mentioned there, the speed and the endurance factor. Sorry, the speed and the hybrid players being rare, being able to run that like 10 meters per second type numbers. Does that potentially make them a little bit juicier when you're like picking them in the draft, or you're trading for them because they're a bit more of a rare find?
And I think there's always going to be a balance between, like, people always like, you get two ends of the spectrum. It's like, you know, oh, the AFL went down a route of just drafting athletes, for example, versus drafting footballers. And I think people sort of, they go on either end of the spectrum, and it's like, oh, well, he might be a good athlete, or he can run fast, but he can't play football. Or you've got the other end of the spectrum, he may not be fast or explosive, but he can play football or whatever. I think the balance always lies somewhere in the middle with that. And as I said, it depends on the role that they need in the team. So as I said, if Richmond are looking for an explosive small forward, or in the draft, or something like that, or maybe they're just after an accumulator in the middle or whatever, you've then got to look at does the football in the draft, based off a lot of the combine data, do they have those physical underpinnings to be able to play the role in the team that they're being asked to do? So I think a lot of it goes down from a recruiting standpoint and what the team needs at that standpoint, at that point of view. Are they looking for more inside? Are they looking for more outside? Are they looking for more explosive, halfback flankers? Are they looking for more, you know, um, you know, pressure type players and stuff like that? And as I said, if they want them to play that role, do they have the physical underpinnings to be able to execute that role within that team? So yeah, I think that it is a pretty important thing from a draft point of view, but yeah, it's very individual from club to club and whatnot.
And if you're looking at that from a breakdown of a team of like 22, what do you think approximately some of the breakdowns would be across, like, say it would be 60% of your players are endurance based, 20 hybrid, that sort of thing?
Yeah. And it will be slightly different, like from team to team and the game style and stuff like that. But I'd say probably at least 80% of your squad will probably be more endurance dominant. And this is at AFL level, I'm talking. Obviously, the lower the level you go, the more likely they're going to be more endurance. So that might go up to 95% at like local level or something like that in terms of endurance. But at AFL level, you might get 80% might be endurance. You might get, you know, 10 to 15% that might be speed, and then you might get 5 to 10% that might be like a pure hybrid, or somewhere sort of in the middle within that. So it just shows that, like, your pure speed guys, and when guys are drafting that, those guys are very rare in terms of recruiting. So when you get a guy that can run a sub 2.9, or like those guys don't grow on trees, and being able to get guys that fast, even with good training, um, is incredibly hard to near impossible to sometimes be able to get those guys down to. So they are a rare find, and I think if they can play that role in the team, and if they've got that football ability to match that athleticism, then they're going to be very valuable with that.
100%. I think you're spot on there too. Just with it's not about putting athleticism over the footballing ability, but it is when you can visualize it like that and see the percentages of a team breakdown, and that when you go down the lower levels, those players are more rare. You can just see that's if you can find a player that has everything, they're a great footballer. They have all the football smarts and the IQ, and they can join that up with a great athletic profile. That's when you get someone pretty special, and that's where you're looking at your Harley Reeds, your Justin Martin types, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just going to throw a few numbers at you here from the combine. We've obviously had that recently, so this is a little bit topical at the moment in the lead up to the draft. So the first player I've got here is Leo Lombard, and all of the stuff that you've been telling me throughout this interview has kind of I've just been thinking of Leo Lombard in the corner of my head here. So he went 2.85 seconds for the 20-meter sprint. And then he did a 6-minute 39 2-kilometer time trial. So I spoke to him after the combine, and he said he has got closer to a 6:30 in the past, but he's put on significant size, I guess, to try to increase that strength and power with his running. A 2.85 20-meter sprint is pretty impressive. Where would you place him on that sort of continuum?
Yeah. Look, he's definitely out of the endurance bucket. Like, I guarantee that he'd be up around 10 meters per second easy. Like that's probably somewhere around that marker, most likely, running those type of times. It's hard to differentiate if he's going to be a speed or a hybrid, because it's hard to know if he's actually, how much of that endurance work he's topped out so far, because
I
you still
suppose
need to
to give you a
factor
little
in.
bit more context, but just to give you a little bit more context on him, he has played like significant minutes in the midfield for both the Gold Coast VFL team and in the national championship. So he does seem to stack up as being a guy that can, like, he's not just sitting in the forward flank sort of thing and being an impact player. He has kind of got that to his game.
Yeah, it's probably likely that he's probably a hybrid. I'd most likely say that he's got a good balance between both. Um, But yeah, guys that can run 2.85 in a 20-meter sprint, like, even if you went through every combine year on out, there might be one or two guys every year that could probably break 2.9 comfortably with that. I'm not sure what it was this year, but I'm guessing he was probably the fastest bloke, maybe, or give or take, in the top one or two. Second, well, there you go. So yeah, there's only going to be a handful of guys that can run, you know, everyone talks about like 3 seconds as a really good number to sort of aim for. And I think that's a very good number in terms of being able to have a very good sort of speed time. But when we're sort of getting down towards that 2.9 sort of bracket, that's when it's really starting to separate the guys between, as I said, those pure speed guys versus guys that are fast, but probably still not quite in that speed sort of bracket with that.
Just while we're on this point here, I think when we talked off the top, we talked about like some of those terminology that we use, like explosiveness, and Lombard. He kind of looks like one of those guys that is very explosive. And when we talk about the 20-meter sprint, I've spoken to you about this in the past, but some of those like 5-meter breakdowns, can you just like quickly go over that a little bit? Just the difference between a 20-meter sprint time and potentially like the first 5-meter interval.
Yeah. So realistically, the 20-meter sprint it's a pure measure, like it's a measurement of acceleration, but most footballers probably won't hit max velocity until at a minimum 30 meters. But some of those guys that are like that, like Lombard or whatever, he's probably hitting it probably after 40 meters. So where he's sort of excelling here is that very early acceleration sort of component, and his ability, when we talk about explosiveness and to be able to go from 0 to 100 very rapidly, he would probably demonstrate that like to a very high degree. But even if we break down the 20-meter sprint, which is a relatively short acceleration run, we can even break it into shorter periods. So we've got, as I said, you're right, that they normally track the 5-meter, the 10-meter, and the 20-meter sort of split. Generally, there was even some research that came out between drafted and undrafted guys. What they found was that the max velocity wasn't that different between the drafted and the undrafted athletes, but what they found to have some correlation was actually their sprint times over like the first 5 meters, or basically what their ability to apply horizontal force or horizontal power in the early parts of the race. So generally, when you look at an athlete that's more explosive or out of the blocks real rapidly, they're going to have this very good horizontal power output. And to be honest, that's like probably the easiest to train, that section. Where, as I said, the velocity side of the equation, or that max velocity, is improvable, but to a much like smaller degree compared to that early acceleration component, which where the athlete has more time on the ground to produce force. A lot of the stuff we're doing in the gym and the explosive work, resisted sprint work, plyometrics, etc., we're going to have more time to maximize that stuff in that early acceleration phase, compared to say like that max velocity sort of phase with that. But yeah.
Would you have a player theoretically that was quicker over 5, but then slower over 20?
Yeah, like I'm sure that like like, are you talking about me personally or just like in theoretically
Oh
in
no,
terms of
like at the comp. So we don't get these numbers, so it's hard to put it to anything. But you could theoretically get a player that had a faster first 5 and then slowed.
yeah. I think don't get me wrong, like if you've got a really good first 5, you set yourself up to run at least a decent sort of 20-meter sort of time. So generally, there's obviously there's clear differentiation between some of these athletes. You're gonna have some athletes that their last 15 meters of the 20 is very good, and you got to have some athletes, if their first 5 is really good, they can still run the same time as the athlete that has a higher velocity, but because their early acceleration was so much better, they can compensate for that lack of top speed with that. Whereas the other athlete, their first 5 meters might suck, but because they need to take a while to get going, they actually reach a high velocity towards the end of the 20-meter. But if you actually look at the time at the 20-meter at the end, it's the exact same. So you can have 2 athletes that can run the same time but have a different strategy in regards to getting to that time. And that's where in football, it's about how quickly we can accelerate rapidly to be able to create separation or close down space, as I sort of alluded to at the start. So how you sort of go about training them will differ with that. The guy that perhaps has a poorer start relative to their velocity is going to have to spend a lot more time improving force output. So whether that's in the gym getting stronger, more explosive, whether that's through more specific work through like heavy resisted sprinting, more specific jump work and whatnot. That's probably where you're going to more gear and focus that towards. Whereas the other athlete that has a really good start and might be deemed powerful, but their velocity or their speed, elasticity, whatever, you can use whatever term you want, tends to, drop off pretty quickly. They're going to probably have to spend more time with longer sprint reps, more faster plyometrics with fast ground contact times, working more of that elasticity sort of component, which is probably a little bit harder, as I alluded to before. But as I said, you could have 2 athletes and just train them. You got to train them based off their strengths and weaknesses a little bit with that. And that's just where profiling and testing can be a real differentiator for a lot of these athletes. Because if you don't have those split times, then it's sort of you're going off your eye and your feel based off what the athlete's sort of going off.
So would you, looking at those tests from the combine, what would you say is for you like the most important things to be able to gauge from that? Would you be more interested in the 20-meter sprint as a whole? Does that give you enough information, or would you need the 5?
Yeah, I think the more data, the better. Like the more that you've got can paint the bigger picture. I think, like realistically, what would be cool would be a 30-meter sprint, but with 5-meter segments along the way. I think across the whole sprint, I think that would probably be cool because, as I said before, most footballers aren't going to be reaching top speed until at least 30 meters into the run. So none of them are probably getting even that close to their top speed, realistically, at 20. So it is a measurement of earlier acceleration, regardless, with that. Um, yeah, so I think that 0 to 5 split is a pretty cool number to sort of look at. But overall, what that entire 20 is still going to be pretty important with that as well, I guess.
Yeah, I guess you're not going to get huge anomalies with the first 5 versus the 20, I suppose, over that shorter period of time. So it still gives you a
Yeah,
decent look.
yeah, I agree, but also like even I've seen like even with some of the numbers I've seen with guys like there can be because like the first 5 meters is the greatest rate of change in velocity. I'm pretty sure in the first like 2 steps you can already get to 40% of your top speed. So if you do stuff up those first 3 or 4 steps, that can have a pretty significant impact on the remaining 10 or 15 meters of that run. So um, because it has the greatest rate of change, yeah, as I said before, if you have a poor start, it can really affect the 20 meters sort of your final time with that because it's over such a short distance with that. So yeah, I do think there is still a lot of merit with that first 5 and even first 10, really, if we're looking at sort of that as well.
I wish we could get our hands on some of those numbers. I'll just throw a couple more players from the combine at you. I think one that like a lot of people are interested in is Harvey Langford. Now he's a big-bodied midfielder, very strong, but probably does lack that power element that we talked about, which is that combination with the speed. Um, so he's able to use his strength. He wins a lot of like contested possessions around the footy, and he's got pretty good foot skills. So he sort of uses that. People had a massive eye on his combine, and he went 3.24 in a 20-meter sprint, and then he ran around a 6:20 in the 2 kilometer time trial. So I think people were actually impressed with his 2 kilometer time trial. They were thinking maybe that was going to be up closer towards the 7 minutes. So he did pretty well there, but does obviously have that lack of speed at the top end.
Yeah, and I think this is why people, without the data, it's hard to sort of blanket or bucket athletes into certain things. Just because he has a similar body type to, say, a certain player doesn't necessarily mean that he's got the same physiological underpinnings as that. So he would fall very heavily into the endurance side of the bucket if I'm looking at a profile thing, but he's quite strong as well. So yeah, from him, he would just be deemed as a strong inside mid that could probably run all day. Like that's probably the way I'd probably look at it from his sort of point of view, with how he would play. But as I said, then again, it goes down to um, you know football smarts. How can he create time and space? Because there's certain footballers, like you look at the old days, like Sam Mitchell and Scott Pendlebury, where these guys may not necessarily be very fast if you break down like all their times from combine data, but because they're so agile and they can read the play so well and they're thinking well ahead of the game, they buy themselves more time to be able to dispose of the ball because of their superior, I guess, football ability and football smarts compared to like the physical side of things with that. So yeah, you can certainly yeah, even though if we looked at it from a pure physiological standpoint, I wouldn't classify him as necessarily powerful as such, but yeah, as I said, there's other ways on the field where he could appear more powerful based off how he sort of plays the game, I guess.
100%. And I guess that ties into the idea of the game changing a little bit with players. You look back even a bit further than you mentioned, players like Greg Williams who didn't rely on their speed. I guess it is going a little bit more in the direction of like needing that upper end speed. But a player I think like that does lack that top end speed, they probably need to have something else. And a player like Harvey Langford, he's definitely got like the ability to, like with his foot skills that I mentioned, and the fact that he's 190, he's like a bigger, stronger body in midfield, and then he can drift forward. And this is probably another question I've got for you. In some of those players that can go forward and take a mark overhead. Now, Langford didn't test well at all in the vertical jumping, but he's really good overhead. And yeah, I guess that's just a little bit of a sort of dichotomy there that's hard to sometimes understand. You think of a player that takes marks as being athletic and being able to jump, but I guess there's other things that can go into that too, like strength and things. I'll let you
Yeah,
take over.
yeah, 100%. But yeah, like usually you'll tend to see a relatively decent correlation between vertical jump and speed if we're just talking like a pure output and whatnot. But I think you've got to look at factors like all right, how tall is he? If he's 190 centimeters, he's probably not going to be, he's going to be playing on players in that middle range as well. So if he's taking these big pack marks and stuff, because he's he could potentially be a lot taller than a lot of these guys. As I said, he has good footy IQ. He knows what the drop of the ball is going to be, like all these things that he can, and then as I said, we talk about strength, the type of mark he's doing. Is it more one-on-one contested? Is he running and jumping at the ball and leaping over players? Like you look at Shea Bolton, he can do that off 2 steps and jump over players when he's some of those big mark of the year sort of contender marks that he's done over the years. I guess you got to look at the type of mark and like how it's playing. But there's so many factors that can impact that. Like as I said, like did he throw the player off earlier in the contest by his strength to then create more space so that he can then run and jump at the ball and give himself more time because of the work he did earlier in the passage? Or was it literally that he just ran and jumped at the ball and just ran over the top of people? So you don't always get the full picture with that. But I think marking ability is obviously a skill, but it's also related to body work and what's happening around, confidence to be able to run and crash through a pack, how tall they are, and all that. So there's a multitude of factors that could go into how good of a marking ability someone sort of has with that.
Just on that with the marking and the vertical jumping, if you're looking from the combine at standing vertical versus running vertical, how would you differentiate those? And, why would somebody test well in the running but not the standing?
Yeah, so look, very rarely in a game is an athlete going to go from a standing sort of vertical jump. There might be a couple of outliers, but across the board, most like jumping in a game is going to be with an approach. So generally, the reason why the standing vertical jump is still a valid test is it's generally a measurement of just general power. So can the athlete accelerate themselves from a dead stop and be able, and that's why it tends to match up pretty well with that 0 to 5 meter time because you're having to accelerate from a dead stop. So it's about your ability to overcome inertia and produce force with a bit more time. So whereas with the approach jump, because you're obviously generating more momentum, you're going to be jumping off probably less knee bend. Whereas with the counter movement jump, there's generally a fair dip, so you can use more. You have more time to use your legs to generate power. Whereas with the approach jump, it's going to be more elastic in terms of because it's shallower joint angles, more of a rebound off the floor. You might have one athlete that doesn't test super great in a standing vertical jump, but their approach vertical jump is a lot better, and vice versa with that, just based off their profile. As I said, generally stronger, more powerful guys will probably be better off a more standing start, and more elastic guys will probably be better off more of an approach with that.
That's interesting. And I look at Leo Lombard, the one that we spoke about before, and he tested well in those areas as well. Another one, which is a high prospect, Sullivan, who went sub 3 seconds in the 20 and sub 6:30 in the 2K. He was another one that tested well in the jumping as well. So it's showing that you have this kind of like, universal sort of athletic profile, right?
Yeah, 100%. And then you've got like agility tests and stuff in there as well, which like it is important as well. But I think all you're doing with the data is just collecting basically, as I said, where the athlete's strengths and weaknesses lie. Are they well rounded? Do they need to work on certain things? Because something as simple as the approach jump, like, because they're going to do both off right and left leg, I'm pretty sure. Like a lot of the time, like if you had like a smaller midfielder that doesn't practice approach jumping that often, or like a small inside midfielder or something like that, then sometimes coordination can play a large role with approach jumping as well. So that's why sometimes there's a big gap, because if you look at like basketball players or NBA players, like they're always practicing, off the approach. Like that's like how they play the sport. Whereas a lot of there's certain footballers like midfielders and stuff like that might do zero jumping in a game or virtually nothing in a game, and they haven't practiced that coordination pattern to time up what they call like the penultimate step to generate power to spring up and whatnot. So sometimes the data can be a little bit, depending on their coordination and stuff as well. You can see a bigger gap with that as well.
That's really interesting as well. Yeah, just kind of marrying up the entire combine and everything they do sort of gives them a bigger picture. So some takeaways from this, as far as the training methods go, what are sort of the biggest things that you still see, probably mistakes within training around all of the kind of literature that we just went over and everything like that? What do you see that players do or clubs do that's probably still a bit against this or not with it?
Yeah, I think blanketing everyone into the same sort of bucket when it comes to training and stuff like that. And I know it gets harder when you've got large squads of players and maybe not enough coaches to be able to facilitate all this bucketing, I guess. But I think when people go back to pre-seasons should be a lot more individualized based off what the athlete needs. And this is from local level all the way through to, elite AFL level, is that often I see athletes get the exact same program or they do the exact same session the whole time. You got guys that can run 620, 630, 2K time trials, flogging themselves in October, when if you look at you know, their power, their speed, all these metrics, they're significantly behind the eight ball. Um, I'm always of the big belief that, when it comes to like off season and pre-season training and stuff like that, that pre-Christmas you should be very much heavily working on your weaknesses as an athlete while still trying to maintain your strengths. Whereas once you get post-Christmas and you start gearing up closer to games, you want to start to hone in your strengths while maintaining the weakness that you've been working through. So I think having a bit more of a plan and a bit more of an individualized, tailored approach, um, I think would help a lot of footballers at all level, whether that's junior, local, professional, um, elevate their game year on year and trying to get that little bit better across the whole variety of performances. Because, as I said, if you can already run a 622K, trying to get that down to a 615 or a 612, is that really going to have a significant impact on your ability to play football? Maybe, maybe not. I'd say probably not. But it could be your ability to, your skills might be the limiting factor. It could be your power or your explosiveness, or just if you can slightly move that speed reserve up a little bit higher, that could make a pretty significant impact on your performance. So basically, to answer that question is, I think, be a bit more critical with where you're at as an athlete, um, and sort of start to work on the things, especially earlier on in the preseason, work on the things that you're probably not as good at, and then hone in on the things that you are good at as you get closer towards the season. With that, instead of just doing the same thing that everyone does year after year and not really getting any better as an athlete because you don't have the necessarily high outputs to be able to cope with the higher levels of sport. Because that's the thing, like if you go the higher the level you play, the faster the athletes are. If you're, depending on the style, that if you might be a half forward flanker at local level, but if you want to go up to play VFL football or AFL footballer, half forward flankers might be very quick or very explosive. So for you to play that role in a higher level, you just simply may not be able to have that the attributes to be able to go to that level unless you work on it and try and improve it as much as possible with that. So yeah, I think just individualize it a bit more.
Awesome, mate. And you've given plenty of awesome insights there across that podcast. Now, where can people find you? You do a lot of stuff on socials as well as taking on like new sports clients, including like aspiring AFL players and stuff like that. Where can people find you and get in contact with you?
Yeah, probably Instagram is probably the easiest. At performance coach underscore Edmunds. Um, yeah, I put out a fair bit of info. Um, fairly like a lot around AFL football, but I guess sport in general around, especially things around power, speed, strength, and explosiveness and whatnot. As I said, which is an area that a lot of people probably struggle to program and train. So, I guess if you want to learn more about that, then follow the page and yeah, hopefully there's some good resources on there that can help you improve those type of things.